So we're continuing on with our series in Esther this morning, Esther and the hidden king. You might maybe even say Esther in the search for the hidden king, as we look for that hidden king in the story of Esther, in the pages of that really relatively short book. As we look for God, as we look for Jesus, as we look for a way in which we can live, in which we can go out and express our faith and serve God and serve the people and love each other and love God even better by looking at the example set for us within this story. Got quite a bit to go through this morning, so let me just pray a second for God's leading, praying again, and then we will go straight to our text. Let's pray a second. Heavenly Father, pray that you open our ears, open our hearts, open our minds, that we may hear, that we may know, that we may be transformed by your word this morning and by your message for us, Lord. Pray that you would send us out as examples for you and as witnesses for you, living boldly and proclaiming boldly the message of your Son. In Jesus' name, amen. So Esther chapter 2 this morning, I'm going to start off by just going ahead and reading the whole passage, and then we'll go back and we'll look at some of the details and some of the exciting things and great things that are contained here. Esther chapter 2, we're going to be looking at the first 18 verses. So later, when King Xerxes' fury had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what he had decreed about her. Then the king's personal attendants proposed, "Let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. Let the king appoint commissioners to every province in his realm to bring all these beautiful young women into the harem of the citadel of Susa. Let them be placed under the care of Hegai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women, and let beauty treatments be given to them. Then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." This advice appealed to the king, and he followed it. Now there was in the citadel of Susa a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai, son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, among those taken captive by Jehoiakim, king of Judah. Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother. This young woman, who is also known as Esther, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother died. When the king's order and edict had been proclaimed, many young women were brought to the citadel of Susa and put under the care of Hegai. Esther was also taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Hegai, who had charge of the harem. She pleased him and won his favor, and immediately he provided her with beauty treatments and special food. He assigned to her 7 female attendants selected from the king's palace and moved her and her attendants into the best place in the harem. Esther had not revealed her nationality and family background because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. Every day he walked back and forth near the courtyard of the harem to find out how Esther was and what was happening to her. Before a young woman's turn came to go into King Xerxes, she had to complete 12 months of beauty treatments prescribed for the women, 6 months with oil and myrrh, and 6 with perfumes and cosmetics. And this is how she would go to the king. Anything she wanted was given to her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would go there, and in the morning return to another part of the harem to the care of Shazgaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She would not return to the king unless he was pleased with her and summoned her by name. When the turn came for Esther, the young woman Mordecai had adopted, the daughter of his uncle Abihail, to go to the king, she asked for nothing other than what Hegai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the harem, suggested. And Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. She was taken to King Xerxes in the royal residence in the 10th month, the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. Now the king was attracted to Esther more than to any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And the king gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all his nobles and officials. He proclaimed a holiday throughout the provinces and distributed gifts with royal liberality. So about 3 years have passed since chapter 1. I know it's a short break in terms of where the story is and the pages and the verse breakdowns and things like that, but about 3 years or so have passed. And what we saw last time, we saw Xerxes throwing a party, Vashti was deposed, and now we're at a point now where it's been recommended to Xerxes, go and find a new king. And we're given these dates. We're given very specific dates all throughout this story. And actually, even when you look at the Bible as a whole, we're given a lot of dates, very specific dates for a very particular reason. It's not just because they want to, write this as a history. It's not just because they want us to know exactly when it is that these things would happen. I think there's actually a bigger reason sometimes behind some of these dates. And now what we're looking at here in this chapter, in chapter 2, actually in these first 18 verses of chapter 2, we're looking at the years 480 to 478 BC. 480 to 478 BC. So about a 3-year stint that we covered just in these first 18 verses. And I point that out because, and I think this is something that happens too, I point that out because these years, historically, are some of the most definitive, if not the defining years of Xerxes' reign and Xerxes' life in history. I'll give you a little bit of what's going on here, and I think this is really important for setting us up. In the year 480, Xerxes went to war with Greece. He went to war with Greece. And most of us, we've heard about this war with Greece at some point through our school, through history classes, or whatever it may be. We've heard about this war. And during this war in 480, there was this famous Battle of Thermopylae, where Xerxes and his army, his massive army, went to war with about 7,000 Greek soldiers led by 300 Spartans. That's this 300 thing that I've referred to before. They go to war. Greece is outnumbered 10-1 by Xerxes' army. And they hold off Xerxes' army for 3 whole days before Xerxes finally overpowers them. 10-1, and they hold them off for 3 days. Now that should never have happened. If you think about what we've seen so far and where this story has gone, Xerxes is the most powerful person in the world. He's got the most powerful army and government. Nobody can stand up to him. And by comparison, Greece is a relatively small country made up of a whole bunch of city-states that can't get along with each other. They never should have held Xerxes off this long. Xerxes should have just been able to walk in there and just plow him right over and do his thing. The whole purpose of this war was that Xerxes could go and he wanted to destroy Athens. He just wanted to get to the city of Athens and destroy it. And that kind of goes back to this grudge going back to his father Darius, and there's all this other history that plays into that. So Xerxes goes to war. The Greek army, they hold off Xerxes for 3 days at the Battle of Thermopylae. Simultaneously, there's also a naval battle going on between Greece and Persia at the same time. And in that battle, Greece is outnumbered 8-1 in that battle. Now, Xerxes ultimately wins that battle on land, and he makes his way all the way to Athens. But that naval battle, Greece absolutely decimates the Persian navy. They're outnumbered 8-1, and they absolutely decimate Xerxes' navy in that sense. Xerxes gets to Athens finally, by land. Gets to Athens, and the city has been abandoned. It's been evacuated. It's been abandoned. Everything of value has been taken out of it. They plunder what they can, but for all intents and purposes, news gets back to Persia, and this whole campaign, this whole war is really seen as a massive failure. There was all this time that was spent put into the planning process. Xerxes actually built a canal to cut across an isthmus so his boats didn't have to sail all the way around this little isthmus of Greece. He actually had his men dig a canal right through land. They stockpiled supplies all throughout the empire. He amassed this massive army and military. Years of planning went into this. Tons of money went into this. And they finally get to Athens, and it's a bust. There's nothing there. They don't acquire Greece. They don't take over. They don't add that land. They don't get any riches or wealth out of it. They even kind of go back limping because they were massively defeated on one battle, and it took them forever to win another one. And so they go back. News gets out. It starts traveling around Persia. And the people of Persia start getting antsy. They start getting really kind of frustrating, and things get chaotic, and people start rioting, and there's all these kind of rebellions that kind of spring up. And at one point, 2 other men, actually, in addition to Xerxes, make a claim and start competing for kingship over Persia. There's actually this 3-way power struggle that takes place in Persia. Remember, this is the most powerful nation in the world, a man who can't be touched. And all of a sudden, his empire is falling and crumbling around him. And Susa is especially chaotic. So Xerxes goes back to Susa from Greece to try and quell a lot of this dissent that's going on. And he gets to Susa, and he falls into kind of this almost kind of manic depressive state where he goes through these periods of drawing away and isolating himself and being extremely antisocial to going the opposite direction and just completely blowing loads of money and really just throwing himself into sexual indulgence. He just goes to these extremes and these swings from one end to the other. And it's in that context that the suggestion is made, Xerxes, maybe it's time to get a new queen. Maybe it's time to get a new queen. Maybe it's time to do something that can work to kind of bring peace and order back to the kingdom and reunite everybody. You're in shambles. The kingdom is in shambles. You just got done with this disaster, this wreck of a war. You've got to do something, Xerxes. And now I point that out right here at the beginning because on one hand, it's just kind of part of the historical context that leads into these verses. But the other side of it is that we never think about that war between Xerxes and Greece as in spiritual terms or in theological terms. The way that we tend to think about that and talk about that is entirely secular. This is just something that Xerxes did because kings like to go to war and fight people and stuff. God wasn't in that. Israel wasn't involved. There was nothing on the line theologically or spiritually or anything like that in terms of salvation or Jesus that was on the line there. That's just kind of a point of history over there. The Bible never talks about it. But if that war had not gone the way it was not supposed to go, in other words, Xerxes was supposed to win, but if that war had not gone where Xerxes came back limping, there would never be a need for Esther. God works in history. Even when we don't think we see him, even when we don't readily recognize him and see him at work and what he's doing, God is there and he is orchestrating what goes on in the world and in history. And he is making and he is working out his plan and his purpose for salvation and for his people, even where we least expect to see him. And we find ourselves in that position then with Xerxes depressed, Xerxes holding his head. The kingdom is on the verge of completely falling apart, and Xerxes is in danger of losing everything that has been built up for him. And it's there in verse 2, where one of his personal attendants says, "Let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king." Then down to verse 4, "Then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." Xerxes, you got problems here, man. I know you know it, and I know you're kind of dealing with this and trying to figure this out in your own way, but what you're doing ain't working. You got to try something else, Xerxes. Get a queen, because things were going pretty well when Vashti was around. Your empire was thriving. It was growing. It was going exactly the way you want it to go. And then you get rid of Vashti, and now you got this. You got to do something here, Xerxes. Get a new queen. Do a search. Hold a beauty contest. Something. Just get something going. Get a new queen. You need something to unite the country. And this advice appealed to the king, and he followed it. Xerxes thinks, it's not a bad idea. I think I'm going to do that. I think that's what needs to happen. It's time for me to get out of this rut. Let's get a new queen. Let's do something about it. So then he puts out this edict. He puts out this call to action to bring in all these young women, that a search be made of all of these young women throughout the empire, wherever it is that they can find them, bring them into Susa and make them part of his harem. That's kind of this little side thing he's got going on for his own little thing, and you can use your imagination or not, or whatever it is you want to do with that, but that's over there, and that's what kings did, and that's what Xerxes did. Bring them in, and it's through that Xerxes is going to look for a new queen, look for somebody to take Vashti's place, to try and reunite this kingdom and make things better. It's at that point that we're introduced to two new characters for us. Remember, last week I mentioned that whenever we look at Hebrew narrative and Hebrew storytelling, kind of like this, what you find, what you have to kind of keep in mind is that the way a character is introduced to us initially, that says something about the role that they're going to play in that story. So we saw that with Xerxes being portrayed as sort of the anti-God. We saw Vashti being portrayed as the one who opposes the enemies of God. And now we have these two new characters, everybody's favorite characters in the story, Mordecai and Esther. And we got to look now, we got to spend some time now looking at how are they introduced and what do they have, what is being suggested about what their role is going to be in this story. So verse 5. Now there was in the citadel of Susa a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai, son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, among those taken captive with Jehoiakim, king of Judah. Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother. This young woman, who was also known as Esther, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother died. So we have to look at how these people are being initially described. What is the role that they're going to have in this story? So we'll start with Mordecai and just that question. How is Mordecai described? What does the author want us to know and understand about Mordecai? First thing it says is that Mordecai is a Jew. And that doesn't surprise us. Of course he's a Jew. This is the Jewish Bible that we're looking at, a Jewish story. We know that. We know that somebody's got to be a Jew here. Why not Mordecai? So Mordecai was a Jew, but he's not just any Jew. It says he was of the tribe of Benjamin. He was a Benjamite Jew. And that right there, that's key. That is really key right here. See, Benjamin, the tribe of Benjamin was what was commonly become known as the least of the tribes of Israel. You think back, again, Old Testament history, kind of going back to Genesis, and you have these 12 sons of Jacob, and Benjamin was the youngest of those sons. He was always looked at, the youngest in any family was always looked at as being the least. So if you're the youngest, if you're the baby in the family, be glad that we don't hold to this anymore. You get a little more respect than they used to get back then. It works a lot better out. It works out a lot better for you now these days than what it used to. But you were considered to be the least. And you could have been the biggest and the strongest kid in the family, but everybody was always constantly looking at you as, oh, you're the weakest and you're the least important. You don't really matter. You get the leftovers. After all the inheritance has been doled out and after all the property has been divided out and separated, all of it really going to the firstborn, you get whatever's left over. You get the crumbs. You get the scrap. You get the, whatever is left in the field after the harvest. That's you. That's your inheritance. Be glad that you at least get that. That's kind of the attitude in many ways with some of these families. But when we look at the Bible, what we see is this pattern that happens over and over again of the least becoming the first. And that's kind of the case with Benjamin and with the tribe of Benjamin. They were considered the least of the tribes, and yet they're also a royal tribe. They were a royal tribe. As Israel was making that transition from the judges to the kings, the first king of Israel, King Saul, was a Benjamite. And he sets a precedence, and he sets something in order that is always looked to. They are a royal tribe. And we look at this description of Mordecai. He's the son of Jair, son of Shimei, the son of Kish. These are not royal figures, but they were attached to King Solomon, King David's son. And so there is this royal association that is coming in there. And then you go a little further down in that verse, and you see 1 to verse 6, and Mordecai is attached to King Jehoiakim, king of Judah. He's brought into the picture and connected with King Jehoiakim. There's all this royal terminology that's starting to come out here, and it's all tied back to Mordecai being a Benjamite. Mordecai's tribal heritage is the thing that the author considers to be the most important. The most important thing you need to know about Mordecai is what tribe he comes from, and how that plays into, really going to play into things next week. So I have to just kind of leave that there for now. Let's move on to Esther. Because Esther is actually a little more interesting to me, at least. And Esther, we all like Esther. We all want to get to Esther. That's what this book, the book is named after Esther. We want to get to Esther. What is it about Esther that the author thinks that this story says is the most important thing about Esther? Well, she was Mordecai's cousin. Okay? She was Mordecai's cousin. She was orphaned, which kind of sets her, sort of in the back burners of society. People didn't want to pay attention to orphans. She had no father, no mother. She really had no status. She might as well have been cast out on the street or in the gutter because all of a sudden she's a girl, so she's worthless to anybody as far as they were concerned, but she has no family anymore. She's been cursed by God, to look at this through Jewish eyes. But Mordecai takes her in and raises her as though she were his own daughter. That's something that her uncle should have done, by the way. And instead, it's a cousin that does it. She's the only character in this story with two names. She's the only character in this story with two names. When we first introduced to her, we're given her Jewish name, Hadassah. Hadassah, her given name, her Jewish name, and one thing is that it shows that she was really still deeply connected to her Jewish roots. And in the Bible, oftentimes names have meanings, and Hadassah means myrtle, which references the myrtle tree or myrtle wood. And in ancient Judaism, the myrtle tree was a symbol of beauty. And so we start off already with her beauty being emphasized, her physical appearance being emphasized. And the second name she's given is Esther. And Esther is her Persian name, which shows that even though she was tied deeply enough to her Jewish upbringing, her Jewish heritage, to have a Jewish name, she's also very much assimilated into the Persian culture around her to be given a Persian name. And this Persian name, Esther, it actually comes from, it kind of derives from an Akkadian god, which is another one of those tribes, an Akkadian god by the name of Ishtar. And so Ishtar was considered the goddess of love and war. Was the goddess of love and war. And she was, get this, the patron goddess. Ishtar was the patron goddess of prostitution and independent women. Now, I don't know what exactly an independent woman is. It can get some sense. You look back at Vashti and how she acted, and you think ahead a little bit about what's coming up with Esther. But this is how Esther is described. This is how the story of Esther wants us to see the person of Esther as somebody who, one, is connected with this symbol of beauty, and two, is connected with really prostitution and independent women. What? What is going on here? What is the deal with this? It all comes together. It all comes together. And then there's this triple emphasis in verse 7. As if all of that's not enough, she had a lovely figure and was beautiful. We have to look at Esther and put her entirely in this realm of beauty, of physical appearance, and frankly, of sexuality. That is the role that she plays in this story and will play in this story. That is sort of the defining characteristic that the author of Esther wants us to get and understand about her. So, Xerxes is looking for a new queen. He brings all these women in. Esther is one of those women, and Esther has kind of been set up because of the name and everything else and the context going on with Greece and with her name and her culture. The deck is stacked in her favor. It's going to happen the way that we know it to happen. There's no possibility that's going to go in any other direction. She comes in, she's brought into the harem, and then we read in verse 9, she pleased Hegai and won his favor. Immediately, he provided her with all these other things. Now, that word pleased and won favor, it's a very unique Hebrew word that really only comes up in the story of Joseph. And remember back to the story of Joseph. Joseph was constantly pleasing and winning the favor of Potiphar and Pharaoh. And this is not just simply him working hard and wearing nice clothes and saying nice things. There was something more supernatural going on there. God was at work in the story and in the life of Joseph, and he is at work in the story and the life of Esther. He is orchestrating this, and he is making this stuff happen the way he wants it to happen. So she pleases Hegai, and then because of that, she gets all this special favor, these added benefits. She's kind of fast-tracked through the process of getting to Xerxes. And the day comes, finally, where her name is called. It's her turn to go into Xerxes' room, to spend a night with Xerxes. And I'll just say right off the bat, she wasn't reciting poetry and singing songs. That is not what was going on there in that night. There's something far more going on there that's more connected to her Persian name and everything else. But she has one night, and she follows the advice of those those who are overseeing the harem and the concubines, and she does whatever it is that she does, but she does win Xerxes' favor. We even see that coming up over in verse 17 when she goes in. The king was attracted to Esther. The word there actually kind of goes toward more to that sexuality side of things, more than to any of the other women. And she won his favor and approval more than the other virgins. Again, going back to that idea, that supernatural winning favor. Last week I talked about how one of the interesting things of Esther, the story of Esther, is that there really is no good, solid hero in the story. We look at this story, we want to read it, and we even hear about it and talk about it, even in Sunday school classes and in childhood. And we're always saying, be like Esther or be like Mordecai and do what they were doing. Have courage, have faith, follow their example. But the reality is that when we look at how Esther and Mordecai are first introduced to us and the things they do and the things they say, they're not exactly good examples for us to follow. Even for ancient Jews at this time, they were not good examples. Yes, sure, Esther, you could say, well, Esther, she obeyed her elders. She took the wisdom and took the guidance of those who were more experienced, and there's a good example in that. But one of the worst things that she does is that she hides her identity. Verse 10, Esther had not revealed her nationality and family background, because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. Because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. They hid who she was. You got to ask why. Why? What was the purpose of that? Why was that such a big deal? Why was that the command and the instruction? We can say, well, it's because they were protecting her. It was kind of in the interest of self-interest. They didn't want Esther to be killed all of a sudden. We just don't really know exactly why, but what we do know is that idea of hiding her identity for a Jew, and I think the original Jewish readers would have picked up on this and they would have immediately been offended and shocked. This was a violation of one of the most fundamental laws that God gave to his people. And it's not just a law that Old Testament Jews are under. It's not just a law that current today Jews are under. It's a law that God's people are under. It's a law that even we today are under. If you think back to the book of Leviticus, because I know you've all read that a million times, and you've got it memorized, you know everything about it. Actually, you probably just know you want to stay away from it because there's all these laws in there that don't make sense. You can't wear these clothes. You can't eat these foods. You can't go to those places. You have to figure out what to do with your mold and your mildew in your house in just a certain way. And you can't talk to certain people or whatever it is. You have all these obscure laws that just makes our head spin. We think, why in the world is God giving all this stuff? But what we miss is that in the book of Leviticus, what's repeated almost 60 times is that core fundamental law, be holy as I am holy. Be holy as I am holy. See, it's not about wearing, single blend clothing. It's not about not eating pork or bacon. It's not about any of that stuff. It's about what that stuff points to. It's about being different. It's about being distinct from the people around you. And even there, it goes back even further than Leviticus. All the way back to Genesis 15. When God makes his covenant with Abraham, that God would be Abraham's God and that Abraham and his descendants would be God's people. And it's a covenant that we still sit under today, that God would be our God. Not some other God would be our God, but God would be our God and we would be God's people. The sign of that covenant was circumcision. The purpose of a sign was to just be a constant reminder of that covenant that was made. And you can't hide circumcision in the ancient world. You just can't do it. You can put your pants on, you can put a cloak on or whatever it is, but it's going to be there. It's going to be visible. You can't hide it, and it's going to make you noticeably different. You can imagine the Canaanites kind of standing there, whispering, oh man, those Jews, they're weird. You see what they do, that whole circumcision thing? That's just weird. You got to stay away from them. They're different. We don't want anything to do with them. That's on purpose. That's intentional. It's exactly the way God designed it, because from day one, he wanted his people to be different from those around them, to stick out like a sore thumb so that everybody around could see them and know that they were different. And that's where you get this law in Leviticus to be holy, to be distinct, to be different, just as I am holy and distinct and different from all these other gods. And when Mordecai and Esther, when they come together and they kind of go into cohorts with one another and they decide, you know what, let's not talk about that. Let's not be different. Let's be the same. The original Jewish readers of the story would have been shocked. They would have been completely dumbfounded. A good Jew doesn't do this. God's people don't hide like that. They're not the examples that we often want to make them be. There's an intentional concealing that goes on that just is absolutely baffling to most people that would read this. Good news is that as much as Esther tried to hide and blend in and cover up and ignore this command to be holy, the good news is that Jesus is a better Esther. Jesus is a better Esther, because Esther, while she failed to live up to this holiness requirement that God put on all of his people, she conceals her identity. She even uses her sexuality outside of marriage to gain something for herself, to manipulate Xerxes, to win royalty and to win this royal position. Jesus, on the other hand, comes along, a few thousand years or so later, comes along, he says, no, this is what it means to be holy as I am holy. I'm going to show you how to live. I'm going to show you what that looks like. And so Jesus comes along and he confronts these guys called the Sadducees and the Pharisees, who created all these extra laws to protect this holiness. He took this cultural norm and understanding of holiness and he flipped it around on its head. See, by the time Jesus came along, the common idea was that holiness or righteousness, holiness, Levitical law, was about condemning people, was about trying to earn something and gain something by your own merits. And Jesus comes along and says, this isn't about death. This isn't about condemning. This isn't about holding you in slavery. This is about showing you how to be holy as I am holy. This is actually freeing to do these things, not condemning. What the Pharisees and Sadducees took to be legalism, Jesus comes along and he shows it as life-giving, a life-giving way that points us ultimately toward God's holiness and points the world toward God's holiness. And so he comes along, he travels around, he talks and he speaks and he teaches and he has all these interactions and he starts saying all sorts of crazy things like, I came to fulfill the law rather than to abolish the law. The law is still here and it's still in effect. And he said things like, pick up your cross and follow me. If you really want to be my disciple, if you really want to know what it looks like to be holy, pick up your cross and follow me straight up that hill. Not figuratively, literally, mind you. That's what you have to do. And then he follows that up and he says, oh, by the way, my yoke is easy. My yoke is easy. My burden is light. This really isn't that hard to do. And he says things like, love God with your whole being, with every facet and ounce of your life. Love God and then show that love and work that love out by loving your neighbor and loving the people around you and pointing them toward the holiness of God. And before he takes off and goes up into heaven to take on his throne as the king, he says, go and do likewise. All this stuff I've been teaching you, go out and you do it and you teach others how to do it. Teach others how to be holy as I am holy. And then we, 2,000 years later, we scratch our heads and we wonder, what in the world does this mean? How do we do this? How can we actually pick up our cross? How can we do and live up to this standard? And how can we be holy as I am holy? And the best answer I have for you is to open up your Bible, turn to the Gospels, and just immerse yourself in them, in the life of Jesus. Take it in and learn it and apply it to your life and use that example. And so what we see, just as a few examples, what we see is we look at like John 4 and Jesus' interactions with the Samaritan woman, and we start looking at how that might apply to our life. We realize that we should go and talk to that neighbor and be nice to that neighbor that everybody has pretty much written off as worthless. There's people who we live next door to and who we run into on a daily basis, who all of our neighbors and everybody else around us says, you know what? They're not worth it. They're not worth your time and your energy. Go talk to them, be nice to them, bless them. And the world is going to look at you and they're going to be absolutely confused. Why? Why are you doing that? It's not worth it. What we do is we look at the Gospels and we look at Jesus and we look at the story where Jesus and his disciples are walking through a wheat field on the Sabbath because they're hungry and they're collecting food, and along come the real righteous people, the real holy people, the Pharisees and Sadducees, and they say, why are you doing that, Jesus? Why are you working on the Sabbath? You got to starve. You can't eat. And Jesus says, Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And we look at that and we wrestle with those words, and we look back and turn it around in our life and we wrestle with, what does it mean for me to keep the Sabbath? How do I do that? How do I keep that? How do I, rather than can protect this day as a super holy day in and of itself and turn it into an idol, how do I instead get into this practice and this discipline of holy rest? Because this is what God desires for me. And we do that, and the world looks at us and they say it's a waste of time because there's too much work to do. There's too many things to get involved in. We look at the story of Jesus inviting the children to sit on his knee, and he says, the kingdom of God belongs to such as these. Don't hinder them. And we look at our life and we look at our families and we wonder, how are we teaching our kids about the holiness of God? What am I doing to show my kids that there really is something to this? That God means something, my faith means something, a life of living in holiness means something. And if you're like me, you start feeling about that tall and you realize every day I give my kids more reasons not to believe this stuff than to believe it. What are we doing? How are we showing and living that holiness just in our own families? How are we showing our kids that the kingdom is even theirs? Esther's failure to be holy was a necessary part of the story that God is working out here. It's one that God used ultimately for his glory, her failure to live up to that standard. And as much as God was able to use Esther and to work through that and to work out his plan, as we will really start to see really next week and in the weeks coming forward yet, as God is really using and working through Esther to work out his plan and his redemption, how much more can he use the ultimate holy one, the better Esther, to make you holy and to make himself known through your own imperfect actions? Be holy as I am holy. And Jesus is a better Esther. Let's pray.